conference. Professor Anthony Steinbock is one of the most renowned phenomenologists in contemporary thought and has published seminal works for the development of phenomenology. His book, Home and Beyond, opened a new dimension in this philosophical tradition, the study of generative phenomenology. He also heads a major center for phenomenology in New York and directs the most prestigious collection of phenomenological thought published in English by Northwestern University Press. His publication, Moral Emotions, Reclaiming the Evidence of the Heart, is particularly noteworthy. And we have the Castilian translation with us in this Congress. His closing lecture at our Congress is titled Feeling, Value, and the Normative Efficacy of Exemplarity. And you have the... Yes. With the tap? No? Take this one.
If I shut off this, will that work? Aha. Oh. What if I...
This one work?
This works. It works. Perfect. Okay, great. Thanks. Okay. I'm just going to set a timer. So. Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Joan Gonzalez Guardiola for the kind invitation to participate in the 15th meeting of SEFE. This is my first time here. Also, Agatha Bach for paving the way for me to join the Congress and for making everything go so smoothly. Thank you very much. And also for the organizing committee for the generous hospitality, and also for all of you who are able to stay until the end. This paper is situated within the broader context of a phenomenology of the heart, and it's part of a larger project, a book project that's entitled provisionally Whispers of the Heart. The broader project attempts to retrieve a distinctive knowing by heart or heart cognition that does not fit into the modern dualism of reason and sensibility. Within this effort, I undertake a phenomenology of vocations. This paper deals with the relation of value to sense or meaning and the normative role of feeling and value cognition and exemplarity. Let me begin by asking how we might account for everyday life-world situations like these. One person walks down a street and sees a person begging for money. Another at the same time and same street notices a stylish person at a food kiosk. Someone walking on a shoreline is struck by a perfectly round and polished stone. Another is drawn to a hunting knife left in the sand. One person is struck in awe at wonder at the majesty of the exploding volcano. Well, Mount St. Helens, that's from Pacific Northwest, where we witnessed that. And another figures out a way of making and selling pet volcanoes with its ash. Someone admires the immediate beauty of an eerie red and orange haze sunset, but at a different time is concerned with mounting wildfires, the effects of drastic climate change, and its impact on future generations. How can we account for these differences? Are they differences in attention that generate interest? Are they differences expressive of variances in reflective attitudes? Are they a matter of judging what's appropriate according to the circumstances? Is it a matter of interpreting perceptual signs? Do they depend upon our cultural backgrounds or genetic dispositions? Are they determined by shifts in focus, like the variations depicted by Gestalt psychology? Do they follow the path of practical interests? Are they shaped by gender or race? All of these explanations, each in their own way, take for granted something still more basic. What we need in order to give an appropriate account for situations like these is a consideration of value and correlatively a description of the role that feeling plays in the existential nexus. For those acquainted with the phenomenological tradition, the phenomenological epocheia reduction is, of course, a familiar term. To summarize its import, rather than let our everyday habits of taking things for granted dominate our thinking and ways of living in the world, and rather than continue to presuppose what something is, we hold in abeyance our prejudgments about the being of the thing and inquire more basically into how it is given. This manner of givenness is also known as the being sense or its meaning. Opening to the given sense or meaning points back immediately to the how of giving or the process of sense or meaning constitution. The most basic structure of this correlative process is captured by the term intentionality. The disclosure of intentionality marks a shift in perspective from taking for granted what something is to its mode of givenness, such that we can now address the posture in which we formerly took things for granted as the natural attitude. Now we can describe the natural attitude as such. When we bracket our assertions of being and examine its yield in terms of the how of givenness through such a radical reflection, we identify the sense of being. Sense is not a thing, an object, or even an echo of an object. Rather, sense is that aspect under which being appears, such that it exposes being with an orientation. Accordingly, we can say that sense is that perspective mode or aspect under which sensible being is given in relation to a perception understood as global bodily kinesthesis. Likewise, meaning is that aspect under which being speaks to us, is comprehensible, and is grasped as such correlative to categorical thinking or judging. I was going to go into some examples or just the basic structure of the relation of concordance and optimality, but Maren Verla did such an excellent job, I'm not going to even attempt it. My exposition would be non-optimal in relation to that. So I'm going to skip ahead, and basically my point here is that what we have, even with the dynamic sense of the constitutive duet of the interrelation of intending and intended, or the constituted and constituted, and that's the general sense. And even with the very dynamic interplay of concordance and optimality, that's not the entire picture. And there's still a dimension of value that's in play, even where sense and meaning are concerned. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon to refer to value as an object of a different type and as belonging to a separate sphere of being. But value is not another kind of object, thing, or being. Rather, value is to be understood as heralding sense, as the integral coloring that imbues the givenness of what it bears to those beings who feel. Just as sense is a way of access to being, or that mode through which being is given, value is that manner through which being sense is given, nuancing the way in which being appears. Just as perceiving is correlative to sense, feeling is correlative to value, although this is not to assert that the intentional structures are the same. This is always something that Juan just indicated in his last response. In portraying the situation in this way, we have to remain cognizant of the fact that these rubrics of sense or being, value, feeling, etc., are not separate acts or spheres, but the byproducts of phenomenological distinctions. A phenomenological distinction is an internal differentiation whose identity can be discerned in a special kind of analysis. The differentiated, identifiable moment does not exist in reality as if it were a self-contained, independent entity. Therefore, such a distinction is not, or is not to be taken as a real separation of things. All of this is happening all at once, as a whole. Concretely, we are always engaged on all levels, on all these levels of perceiving, thinking, feeling in relation to another as bearer of value, appearing in this way or that. Emphasizing that value is not a real thing and that it is not separate from feeling does not mean that value is reducible to feeling, as some authors misleadingly want to portray it. Feeling is that peculiar openness or disposition that is receptive to this kind of giving, coloring, or nuance of sense through which being appears. Value is accessible through feeling, but not produced by feeling. To avoid the understanding that value is merely subjective and therefore reducible to feeling, Max Scheler characterizes value in terms of an objective value range. What he means by objective is not that values are objects or that they are observed through a third-person objective reflection. Rather, values are given through a heart cognition and have a depth or height by virtue of the kind of valence they carry. This is what orders values in relation to other ones for a being who feels without them being reducible to subjective imposition. Furthermore, values have a distinctive independence vis-a-vis their bearers, even though they are only given in and through something that conveys them. This is why we love this person as bearer of absolute spiritual value. We don't love the value of spirit. Still, value is not reducible to its bearer, and this is where it exhibits its kind of independence. For example, the value of pleasantness can be given in a cup of coffee, and it continues to exist even if we drink the coffee to the last drop. Vital values are present, for example, in a nutritious power bar, exercise, reproductive acts, and even though they begin and end, they can be shared intercorporeally. Values appear in a range, not by individual whim, but by features that give themselves an experience such that they are deeper or more superficial, higher or lower in a founding relationship or in their shareability. This founding relation and characteristic of shareability are some of the aspects that constitute their so-called hierarchy. At this formal stage of analysis, the ordering of value concerns their intrinsic structures. For example, an animate organism cannot experience pleasure without living, so the value of pleasure is given from itself as founded in the value of life. The value of life, like the value of spirit, is not dependent upon the value of usefulness. For instance, I can enjoy the beauty of a sunset or anticipate the warm smile of a friend without these in any way being useful, and without the lack of utility diminishing their beauty and warmth. Further, an idea can be shared widely, almost without limits, whereas a loaf of bread can only go so far. This does not mean that the loaf of bread is without value. It can have nutritional value, for example. It is just that their possible participation is different. Finally, each range of value has what can be called a magnitude peculiar to each dimension. That is, there are variations within each value range. I mentioned that values are correlative to feelings, and these are distinctive intentional structures as openings to value. They are distinctive from perceptions as open to sense or judgments as open to meaning. Feeling is the broadest designation for intentional relations that belong to the heart. They admit of different kinds of personal emotions like loving, hating, trust, or despair, to attunements like anxiety or slovenliness, and psychological feelings like erotic intentionality and sympathy. From feeling, I distinguish feeling states, another dimension of the heart. Rather than a dynamic movement, a feeling state is precisely that, a state, such that it can become an explicit object without losing its character as a feeling state. And here examples could include joy, hatred, as opposed to hating, or in distinction to it, pain, sadness, bliss, etc. In this sense, a feeling state is static, whereas a feeling as act movement can never become an object as such. So whereas feelings are dynamic, are realized as movement, and have an intentional structure all their own, feeling states are static, capable of being objectified, and do not have an intentional structure. Further, in and through my feeling as act movement, which is engaged with any other being as bearer of value, a feeling state emerges and is given with that feeling. Okay, that's just a brief summary of the relation of feeling and feeling states. I also noted that the ordering of value concerns those values' intrinsic structures. Depending upon the circumstances, this formal ordering is open to situations that can confound the way in which value is given. And this further contributes to the way in which the sense of an object is perceived. Values, as they inhere in their bearers and nuance the way in which sense or meaning is perceived or known, respectively, can be given in and of themselves without any comparison between values. Thus, I can love a person as bearer of absolute value without entering into a comparison between persons and without depreciating the one in order to prefer the other. Likewise, I can trust another person without performing a risk analysis or options, or a risk analysis of options, or without trying to adjudicate between who is likely to be less of a gamble. But values can also be given precisely in an ordering as deeper or as more superficial. Oh. I don't know if that is. Ah, great. Yes. Or as more prominent and important and less so. Their ordering can be manifest for me in a way that aligns with their a priori intrinsic structures, or it may deviate from them, which may indicate a disordered heart. So I want to turn to a specific feeling that is so encompassing that I call it a metaphysical emotion, namely loving. I do this because an appropriate understanding of loving is important for the clarification of exemplarity, and then also for a partial clarification, at least in terms of what the examples with which I began. Summarizing a few important characteristics, let me note that loving is a dynamic, improvisational movement participating any other, an opening movement elicited from this other as bearer of value toward its own flourishing without being able to anticipate that outcome. It's not to be understood as a feeling state like a sentiment, a mood of being in love or euphoria, and so on. As generative, loving is a movement that extends beyond what is presently given in the direction of the beloved's, whatever beloved's, own most value being. And I mean by beloved here, anything. I refer to loving as a metaphysical emotion because it's open to all dimensions of being as bearers of value and not just personal ones. Thus, loving bears on all reality and on each value magnitude in its own distinctiveness. Because loving bears on all beings as bearer of values, because the beloved, any being, who loves is constituted as person through the generative movement of loving, and because the person is revealed creatively as such in loving, and not accessible as the unique person through properties, concepts, characteristics, etc. Loving is the most profound emotional act movement through which the person becomes in a dynamic coherence. Although it's possible to identify distinctive value modalities such as the useful, the vital, the spiritual, the pleasant, all ranges of value and their magnitudes are intertwined such that the exposure to a deeper value, say spirit, enriches the very value being of, for example, usefulness. Accordingly, an instrument cannot reach its depth of utility by only being functional. It is only useful in the genuine sense if it's animated by loving, for example, in being in service to, which is peculiar to the value of spirit. This is because in the range of values, the instrument delimits spirit as the instrument remains itself useful. It doesn't become spirit or life, for example. Although loving can be directed toward anything, and indeed all beings, the highest form of loving relates to the value of holiness, whose bearer through loving is revealed in a personal manner. In loving, I have the whole value range giving itself ever deeper in loving in a way that cannot be predicted in advance. Nevertheless, bearers of value can emerge from me with prejudice, and in such a way that they may not even be seen as a result of prejudice. For example, something that is a bearer of vital value might be taken as merely useful. A person, as bearer of spiritual value and as absolute, might be taken as a tool, as some means to an end, or merely as an object of pleasure. This may happen knowingly, or someone may have no idea that something is awry. If this is the case, however, a disorder of the heart emerges such that the absolute value of person, which cannot be relativized, is obfuscated, and the dignity of the person is compromised in individual events and perhaps institutional structures. One way this disorder of the heart can take place is through ressentiment. Ressentiment is a kind of value distortion lived implicitly or unconsciously as a reversal of values. Ressentiment occurs if I depreciate, for example, a vital value like strength and elevate, say, weakness because I cannot obtain strength. This may take place spontaneously and unwittingly, but it is often accompanied by a sense of one's own powerlessness in the face of realizing a higher value. This is one of Shaler's observations. But ressentiment can also occur in the inversion of value spheres, for example, promoting use values over vital values in a preference and choice for utility over life. In capitalism, this is even more drastic as the promotion of exchange value over use value, such that even something like a tool realizes its functionality or use inversely in not being useful, but in being exchangeable, in being a commodity, for example. In classical capitalism, the tool cannot even be realized fully as useful. In the hierarchy of values presented here, vital or life values are deeper than use values, and spiritual values are deeper than vital ones. That a use value is more superficial than a vital value or even pleasure is relatively unproblematic. On the one hand, this presupposes that we already value life over use to make this assertion. On the other hand, to be useful is already to be in service of living beings or persons. Health, for instance, is its own value, not simply because it makes one live longer or is pleasurable over sickness. The relative depth of life in relation to utility also comes to the fore when we consider the ressentiment attitude that continued existence and the right to life has to be earned by being useful and is thus subordinated to instrumentality. This would hold that if the living being cannot adapt itself to its utilitarian ethos, it should be destroyed regardless of its vital values. That spiritual values are deeper than vital values might not appear problematic when we experience the joy of being with a loved one while sharing a good meal, or an experience of spiritual consolation and a needed rest because of exercise. The exuberance in working on a new idea or the excitement of solving a problem eclipses the thought of eating or outweighs at that moment the impetus to exercise. But the depth of spiritual values in relation to life values might appear to be more problematic if we consider spiritual values like aesthetic ones to be higher than vital ones. Is it really the case that an artwork or the creation of an artwork justifies the negation of living beings because the artwork as spiritual is higher or deeper? Can animals other than human be sacrificed for the realization of bearers of aesthetic values because the latter are ranked as higher? Such criticisms tend to misunderstand the phenomenon of value and their order. Although it's convenient to speak of a value hierarchy statically, the main insight is not the static ordering of values, but the relation among values. A spiritual value that denies or negates a vital value is indicative of a disordered heart. This is why loving does not depend upon the sacrifice of a lower value. Loving, a bearer of spiritual value, is also implicitly engaged in the enhancement of all values, including vital ones, and not their or its destruction. This is also why pitting a spiritual value against a vital value in loving is not a matter of preferring one over another, and the latter is not a choice between or negation of a lower value, and especially not a disvalue just because another value is deeper or a deeper value is preferred. Again, this would be evidence of a disordered heart and possibly of ressentiment. It would be oriented toward negating or destroying and not toward the flourishing of the articulated unity of being. It would be to strive against a spiritualization of the vital and the vitalization of spirit, whereas the positive movement is what I have termed a delimitation, or what might be called again redemption in the sense of removing limits and abstractions. A well-ordered heart is disposed to the mutual enhancement of values in the value relations. Thus, realizing a spiritual value like a work of art at the expense of vital values or the devaluation or disregard of life is evidence of a different kind of disordered heart, not a well-ordered heart. At issue is not a problematic value hierarchy, a value hierarchy that's inherent in the things themselves. The problem is a disordered heart where the intertwining value relation becomes distorted. So allow me at the conclusion of this section to summarize some of the basic results thus far. So first of all, value is not a thing or an object or essence, but a nuance of sense, which itself presents being. Just as sense orients being, value orients the manner of being. Secondly, value is correlated to feeling, but not reducible to feeling. Feeling is a distinctive intentional structure, as open as to value, and ranges of value, as those values inhere in or imbue being. Third, feeling is a peculiar intentionality of the heart, a dynamic movement distinct from the intentionality of presentational givenness. Both perception and judgment, on the one hand, and feeling are modes of cognition, but whereas sense or meaning that is presented is a matter of epistemic cognition and the acquisition and enrichment of being as disclosive of sense or meaning, value givenness belongs to a heart cognition whereby the orientation toward value concerns the flourishing or demise of being as bearer of value. Fourth, value is foundational for sense and meaning, as feeling, or heart cognizing, is foundational for perception and judgment. Another more provocative way of stating this is that ultimately, sense is senseless and meaning is meaningless without value, since value gives sense and meaning as sense or meaning gives being. Stopping at a cognitive framework with epistemic acts and meaning merely is not only short-sighted but ultimately arbitrary. We have to include, expand, and reorder our account by integrating heart cognition, a knowing by heart, and value into the cognitive framework. Skipping over the fifth one because I'm wrong about that. Ultimately, this is the other six, now it's five. Ultimately, loving incites me to participate being as bearer of value epistemically, especially in a way that even epistemic cognition cannot do for itself. Sixth, a well-ordered heart presupposes the mutual enhancement and intertwining of value relations. Finally, going back to the beginning set of questions, one of the conclusions of the analysis thus far is that one person is oriented toward one situation, while another is drawn to something else because of a distinctive value givenness in feeling, and not merely because the epistemic matter of attention or interest. So now I turn to the phenomenon of exemplarity. It's one thing to describe the relations obtaining between feeling and value, and another to describe how they're efficacious in experience. There are several ways in which they are efficacious, but I'd like to go to the deepest dimension of value givenness and value bearers, which is to say loving in persons. While not the only one, the most encompassing dimension of value efficacy is to be found in exemplarity. In the second section of the paper, I focus briefly on the role of exemplarity because it gives a concrete interpersonal account of how this transpires. So let me begin with a distinction between an example, between the issue of example and the heart matter of exemplarity. So, well, let me just paraphrase this. I want to distinguish an instance from an example and just go straight to a little bit later, an example. An example is a cognitive experience of a different kind than an instance. An example is a relational phenomenon that gives an essential structure. It's a recognitive experience that's disclosive. It does not just give any essential structure, but an a priori that the example discloses as yielding insight, and it only becomes an example in that very process. secondly, the epistemic problem field of the example is to be differentiated from the heart matter of exemplarity. Within the problem field of exemplarity, I make several distinctions. The issue of exemplarity for me is rooted in Shaler's analysis, or at least hints of his analysis. And although I've learned from Ingrid Vendrell that Maria Zambrano has also worked on this problem, I have taken it up primarily from Shaler. But he doesn't make the following distinctions I'm going to make, so let me just advance them here. So an example is an impersonal or anonymous feature. An exemplar is personal. More specifically, it's constituted through a personal relation to a value structure and is always interpersonal. Although exemplars might generally be given in concrete, real space-time relations, I may or may not know the person in real time, but as exemplar, they are concrete, real, and functional as exemplary. So I distinguish that from a model. So whereas an exemplar is a concrete person in an interpersonal relation of some kind, a model is actual without being real. Thus, a model can be a fictitious figure and can function in a relation of exemplarity. I don't have a better term for this. I call it a paragon. Is a non-personal, real, concrete being that exemplifies a particular way of being or trait, and in this way is integrated into a homeworld. We can imagine here the cat's stealth, the dog's ability to track, or the bird's eyesight. And then finally, an essential type is a higher order, non-real, but actual, non-personal exemplary figure. So I mean here a person type, not an ideal or rational course of action like we might find in Weber. We can consider the phenomenon like the teacher, the statesman, the translator, and so on. Okay, I think we can also discern two different types of exemplarity, one that I call spontaneous and another one iconic. Spontaneous exemplarity is the kind of exemplarity that not only takes place directly on the level of my being, but is efficacious without explicit value cognition or striving. It operates so powerfully that I may not even realize the exemplary figures that are efficacious as exemplary. Spontaneous exemplarity takes place, for example, when a younger sibling takes after an older one, when a child takes after a parent, realizing 30 years later, for example, I'm just like my mother, when a student or civil servant takes on the same habits of thought and cultural values as a teacher or political figure. It can show up by contrast, for instance, when I realize that my actions do not correspond to whom I take myself to be, or do not align with what I take to be my value orientation. In this case, something else, some other exemplary figure, is functioning as guide and inciting. Furthermore, I may recognize that I have somehow changed, maybe even through interpersonal relations, but I can do this without any recognition of an exemplar or an actual exemplary figure who was or is efficacious on my being. Spontaneous exemplarity is always functioning in an interpersonal generative structure. Then I think there's something we can call an iconic, or I call an iconic exemplarity. Let's say that I find some path alluring or compelling, but I may have no idea how to become in that way. Iconic exemplarity is often a way that's carried out when I, as emulator, take over certain characteristics, qualities, expressions, or attitudes in order to be like or as the exemplary figure. In this case, I'm not treating the particular characteristics or expressions as ends in themselves or as idols, but as privileged nodal points into the mode of being, implicitly or explicitly taking them up or taking them in as ways to be as the exemplary figure, to be or to do as they are and do, to see in the same way and not to be what they are or to do what they do. The features that I seize upon function as icon and not idol. I do this not to become who they are or lose my identity, but to become who I am to be in creative fidelity to the way revealed in and through the exemplar in my own uniqueness, through these means that have become evident to me. Having seen how those means are successful, they might aid me in getting to the way more quickly. Thus, iconic exemplarity can function as a relation of exemplarity. It is only that it's not necessary in order to have an exemplary relation. There is inciting here, but in this case, it's accompanied by an explicit value cognition and striving. Of course, the fact or the mystery still remains how, and that this way, this value orientation is compelling in the first place. How is it that it speaks to me in such a way that I find it compelling? And this goes to the root of vocational experience. That's the broader project, but not a matter of the paper. Okay, the efficacy of the exemplary figure. In all these cases, a guiding feature, as it relates to the questions posed at the beginning of the paper, concerns the efficacy of exemplarity. This can be seen in multiple value-bearing ways, and this bears on vocational experience. The relation of exemplarity is efficacious on the value orientation of the emulators, their heart tenor, and their personal core as to be loved in these or those vocational ways. The efficacy of exemplarity is operative in at least 4 ways. First of all, the exemplary figures as exemplary are nothing in themselves. As exemplary, they are vehicles of value orientation, of heart tenor formation, and the becoming being of the person. They function as drawing, inciting, enticing, or soliciting. Through a particular action, a person could be exemplary. For example, someone standing up in the face of injustice, simply in this one moment, could open up possibilities for my entire life. Further, the efficacy of exemplarity consists in the transformation of the value orientation of the person, molding the shape of the heart tenor, which is ultimately all rooted in the becoming of personal being. This is how the efficacy of exemplarity relates to vocational experience. In short, the transformation is operative on the level of the heart and bears ultimately upon personal becoming. It is not a matter of modifying characteristics or behavior. Rather, the formation and transformation of the person's heart tenor and any subsequent modifications of action are consequences of the growing adaptation of the person to the exemplar. The transformations are not outcomes rooted in educational directives, commands, or following advice. Third, since the exemplary figures as such are nothing in and of themselves, as exemplary again, the efficacy of exemplarity takes place by living through or acting as or in the manner of the exemplary figure. It is not a matter of being like someone, acting out of duty, copying what someone does as in blind obedience. This means that the emulator can emulate the exemplary figure or can spontaneously take up the way in any number of variations or contexts. The emulator lives or acts in relation to the exemplary figure in the manner of creative fidelity. Within this context, it makes sense for Shaler to assert that there can be no norm of duty without the persons for whom this norm should be valid. There can be no reverence for a norm or moral law that is not founded in love for the person who functions as my exemplar. Similarly, Husserl thoughtfully observes that we can only become good when we see good people, when we become as our exemplars through a transfiguring love. In orienting ourselves to them in this way, we thereby elevate ourselves through them. And this is the real, I think, well, this paragraph is the real point of the relationship of dealing with exemplarity in this way in relationship to norms that we've been talking about in an epistemic register. Even using someone as an example of something still presupposes a deeper efficacy of exemplarity. Someone can be an example of values without being exemplary for me. More specifically, I don't have to have the same length of hair, the same style of clothing, make the same gestures, use the same expressions, be the same gender, speak the same language, etc. as the exemplary figure in order for the emulation to be genuine. To fixate on the exemplary figure or on a characteristic is to reify this way. It can make the exemplary figure into a cultish figurehead. It can transmute the once exemplary relation into a relationship of leadership. Ontologically, it would make the way of being into something, constitutively transposing the relation of exemplarity into a kind of idolatry. What are today called influencers are only influential because of the exemplars we hold through a value heart cognition. However, acknowledging this, exemplarity can go by the way of copying or imitating in a very specific respect in the way suggested above of iconic exemplarity. For example, when I want to be as a person or admire, when I want to be as a person I admire, or when a child wants to be like her superhero, the individual or child might begin by imitating the gestures, copying the style of speech, donning the same superhero outfit, and so forth. But these are not ends in themselves. They are ways into the way of being, and they are taken up as a way of getting more directly into that way of being. That which is being copied in this instance functions again as icon and not the thing in and of itself. And then finally, a free inciting. The efficacy of exemplarity requires, that is, the exemplary figure cannot be efficacious without free inciting on the part of the emulator. To be involved in an exemplary relation is to emulate not only in a creative fidelity according to the way that is exhibited through the exemplar, but in a way that the emulators see for themselves. It happens initially in a free manner without trying to be free, as inciting without compulsion. So there's a distinction between the emulator here and the follower. So to conclude, going back to the opening of the paper, the differences in approaches, behavior, attention, interest, and so forth, given in those examples, are not most deeply clarified merely by epistemic triggers or epistemic registers, but require an explication of a heart cognition in terms of value and feeling. Further, to understand the orientations that arise most deeply with value and feeling, we have to go to the dimension of personhood as interpersonal, where those values and feeling movements are most concrete and profound. And this is a dimension of exemplarity and the relation of exemplars and emulators. Heart cognition is already taking place in order for epistemic cognition to do what it is doing and to take shape. The epistemic does not even start with the epistemic. To be fully human requires us to be more than human from the more than human. It is already guided by a revelation of value. The structure is what I have articulated previously by suggesting that just as sense orients being, value guides sense. Our opening to a world is already taking something up with a value solicitation and value orientation. It is thus a question of how we can evaluate our directedness or know the exemplars that are animating our styles of participating being and participating in the world. It is still a question of how we can detect and criticize the disorder of value in relation of exemplarity. It's important to note that the rational, epistemic, and the emotional or heart cognitions are not separate. I'm not suggesting that a heart knowing replace an epistemic knowing. Rather, the effort is to recognize that the epistemic functions with the heart as value guides sense. In this way, we might say that epistemic knowing can function as a leading clue. Accordingly, what we carry out is not a mere observation, but a participation, such that discernment comes from the genuine concern of becoming better and who we are to be and can be. I can only suggest here that such a critique does not take place through another kind of phenomenological critical reflection, but through a mindful discernment of the heart, which is both interpersonal and historical. And more specifically, it concerns the experience of conflict and diremption in the tenor of the heart, and the discernment of the heart tenor through its generative ethos. Thank you very much for your patience and attention.
We have between 10 and 15 minutes to questions. And, ¿tenéis el micro por allí arriba? ¿El micro para pasarlo? ¿Sí? Yo no veo nada, porque estamos aquí con los focos, no veo absolutamente nada. Llévalo tú, pues que no lo veo. Estamos... many questions? Sí? Yes.
Thank you very much, Tony, for this wonderful talk. I had two questions that are perhaps clarification questions concerning this very inspiring notion of the disorder of the heart and your conclusion. I wonder how to connect perhaps the disorder of the, how to think it, how to transpose it to a collective scale, perhaps in relation to exemplarity. So I think I see a fruitful way of thinking the disorder of the heart as a collective phenomenon, perhaps as a social phenomenon, but I was wondering whether you would go in such a direction, and perhaps the functioning of exemplarity at all the levels indicates a way to develop this. It's my first question. And I was also very sensitive to your idea of the mutual enhancement of values that cannot contradict themselves, or at least vertically at different levels. But I was wondering whether conflicts of values can occur between levels that find themselves at the same level. So, for instance, conflict between different forms of love, not conflicts between love and life, but conflicts between different forms of love. And this kind of horizontal conflict of values can also be perhaps the thought of at the scale of spiritual values or at the scale of vital values as well. Thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you, Claudia. So in terms of, if I understood you correctly, the disorder of the heart in relationship to, or the question discerning the disorder of the heart, either in, as an interpersonal. So I think there are a couple ways. And one way, and as a consequence, the kind of exemplars we hold. Or at least that is one of the things that it's presupposing. One way is through a direct interpersonal relation, and because we're not always necessarily in a position to identify what we hold as a disorder. So it's I don't know if you want to call it a hermeneutic problem, but certainly an interpersonal problem. In relationship to someone who has experienced enough to identify those. But that presupposes not just, again, an epistemic relation, but ultimately a loving relation. Again, loving as this radical openness. And whether it's a teacher, a friend, a partner that sees more deeply into that way of that orientation and to identify it. The other way I think is through what I just alluded to as a generative ethos. That is to say, to examine the relationship between the individual and the community in which I participate, to see, it gives you a distance from yourself, as it were, to see that the orientation of the particular home world and to relate that to one's particular orientation or the values one holds. That's a broader context that one can begin with in order to execute a kind of critique to see if those are the values that are professed and the values that are actually held are in sync or not, and then, as a consequence, the individual. I mean, I think that there are those two. There's also an historical dimension to it as well. So yes, there are conflicts of value on the same level, and I don't deal with that here, but in the rest of it, I think the only thing we can one of the ways we can identify it, or is just namely what it is, namely it can be a tragedy, because it is not necessarily a way to overcome that given particular historical circumstances. The particular values, spiritual values might be in conflict with other spiritual values. And I mean, of course, Husserl identifies some of these, but these are not abstract. They have to be, they're rooted in certain historical situations, economic institutions, and they can be just tragic. Yeah, thanks.
One last question, very shortly. Thank you very much for your magnificent conference, Dr. Steinbock. I hope that is the end. I hope you enjoyed Palma de Mallorca, learned a lot, and have a safe trip home and a well-deserved rest. Esto es el fin. Espero que hayáis pasado un fantástico congreso. Ruego disculpéis nuestros pequeños errores de organización, como son propios de estos eventos tan grandes. Y os deseamos un feliz viaje de retorno y nos vemos pronto en el próximo congreso de la SEFE. Muchas gracias a todos. Queda el congreso.